Rising dramatically above the flat fields of the Somerset levels is the striking hill of Glastonbury Tor, crowned by the shell of a medieval church tower. The Tor itself is rich in legend and myth, reputedly King Arthur's Isle of Avalon. Along the steep sides of the Tor, there's a distinctive pattern of regular step terraces. Their origins are a mystery. I've come to Glastonbury to investigate the mystery of the terraces and to see if there's a connection with the myths and legends that permeate this landscape. Glastonbury's been called the British capital of the New Age. Walking through the town, you soon see why. Strange brews of religion, paganism and myth are continually producing new and even startling interpretations of the Tor and its terraces. For instance, to modern witches, the Tor and the hills around it represent the body of the great goddess, Mother Earth. The Tor itself is her left breast. To other people, the Tor is on a mysterious alignment of sacred sites extending from Cornwall to Wiltshire. And so the accounts go on. But how did it all start? What happened here to make it such a centre of myth and fantasy? And are these strange terraces on the Tor part of that story? It really is a superb view. 360 degrees. There's Glastonbury down there and the flat Somerset levels, and the Mendips away to the north there. The Tor is obviously a spectacular geological feature. Could the terraces themselves be natural? The product of erosion, for instance. Adrian Woodhall of the National Trust, which owns the site, recently commissioned a geological study of the Tor. I'm really impressed with how steep the Tor is. I mean, it rises so abruptly out of this flat landscape round here. How does the geology contribute to that?
Well, we do know that the rock type is much harder than the surrounding levels, and it's basically composed of lower, middle, upper silts and clays, and on top of the upper layer of silts and clays there's a really hard layer of rock called Midford Sands.
So this cap of sands has protected this extraordinary hill and leaves it here standing so isolated. What about these terraces along the flanks? I mean, could geology have anything to do with their formation?
Geologists have told us they're not a feature of natural erosion, but they're probably an activity from man over thousands of years.
So the Tor itself remains because harder rock on its summit protected it as surrounding rocks were eroded. But it's unlikely that erosion could have created such a regular series of terraces. They must have been created by people, but by whom and when? Is it possible that there is evidence still in the ground? A team of geophysicists had arranged to survey the Tor, searching for clues to the origins of the terraces. I caught up with Meg Waters and Steve Wilkes as they began measuring out the area they'd selected. Out of the rain, Meg explained the techniques they were using.
We use magnetometry, and magnetometry is looking for the differences in magnetic fields of the Earth and whatever would be in it. We can see trenches, things that have been excavated into the ground, pits, ditches, things like that.
Right.
We've generated a map of the Tor, and Meg's survey data will be overlaid onto this feature.
The second technique they were using measured resistivity.
With the resistivity, we're looking for the resistance to an electrical current that we actually induce into the ground. We're also measuring trenches where the soil would be kind of mixed up with more air or water in it. Ditches. It also looks perhaps at a compacted path where people would have walked back and forth, or a house floor, something like that.
It was going to take the geophysicists a while to collect and process their data. So I went to see what archaeological evidence had already been found on the Tor. Chris Webster, an archaeologist from Somerset County Council, showed me what little there is.
You can see there's a little bit of prehistoric flint work, most of it fairly scrappy, but there's this rather nice arrowhead here.
Yes, that's rather beautiful, isn't it?
Neolithic leaf arrowhead.
Yes.
But it doesn't actually show settlement up there, it could just be hunting. We don't get any more activity on the Tor really until the early post-Roman period, the sort of period when an Arthur figure might have been there. And from that period, in the 5th and 6th century, we've got these large pottery vessels. These ones would have come from Turkey.
Does that pottery give us any clue as to who the people were and what they might be doing up there?
Not directly. It's obviously quite prestigious to be able to get material from Turkey. But whether it's a kingly residence, a defended site on the top of the Tor, or it could be a monastic site with church contacts to Constantinople.
The evidence may be scant, but it suggests that people have been active on the Tor since Neolithic times, more than 4,000 years ago. So I decided to investigate the various theories of the origins of the terraces. There's a claim that they were created in the Neolithic period to make a kind of maze. Creating them would have been a huge labour, but not necessarily beyond Neolithic people, as other monuments in the landscape show. Within 40 miles of Glastonbury is Silbury Hill, near Avebury in Wiltshire. Constructed more than 4,000 years ago, it's the largest prehistoric man-made mound in Europe. So could the terraces at Glastonbury have been a similar bit of landscape design? Historian Ron Hutton has made a study of Glastonbury and the Tor. I mean, you can trace out a path, a continuous path up from these terraces, can you?
You certainly can. The path is actually harder to trace than it sometimes appears on maps. It's a rather broken spiral, but it can certainly be done. And when this was first made, if it was a sacred walkway, it might be much easier to join them up and make a perfectly good spiral.
People believe that you can trace a maze-like path, winding several miles round the Tor and right up to the top.
It became big news in the 1960s when it was first proposed that it might be prehistoric. Anything is possible in Glastonbury. It certainly could be a Neolithic sacred monument, a spiral labyrinth.
So is it possible the Tor has had a special significance since prehistory, and that the terraces might have been created for some sort of ritual purpose? To test this theory, I needed to find out what people were doing in this area in the Neolithic period. So far, the archaeological evidence consists of a few flint arrowheads, but there is another approach to the mystery. The Tor dominates a large area of flat land known as the Levels. Perhaps finding out what this landscape was like in prehistory might give us a clue to who was living here. There's a place nearby, Shapwick Nature Reserve, where environmental archaeologists have been trying to strip away thousands of years of landscape history. Using an auger, Vanessa Straker was going to take samples of the various layers of peat and silt which have accumulated here over the last few millennia.
My goodness, very soft, isn't it?
It is, it's very soft. We need to twist it to try and...
Yeah, fill the chamber.
And this is the bit.
Just by looking at the sample, Vanessa could get an instant glimpse of what the landscape was like thousands of years ago, and how it was different then.
Wonderful, it's peat all the way down there.
Yes, here we're probably sometime between about 4,000 and 2,500 BC.
This was right back into Neolithic or Stone Age times. But Vanessa wanted to go even further back, to the beginning of the Neolithic period, 6,500 years ago.
Wow. Oh, yeah, here's your peat here, but there's real grey silt. It's quite a sharp line.
Yes, there was a change from a salt marsh condition to a freshwater fen development.
So we're talking thousands of years. I mean, what does that represent in time?
This junction here dates to around about 4,500 BC.
But this means the environment over this period of time was always wet conditions.
Yes, there certainly had been standing water.
So the samples taken by Vanessa show that for thousands of years, and certainly throughout the Neolithic period, this area was flooded wetland. First it was a salt marsh, and then after rising silt cut off the sea, it was a freshwater fen. And nearby you can still see what it would have looked like.
Oh, did you see that fish?
Yeah.
Just saw a fish jumping.
Here in the nature reserve, the landscape is reverting to a freshwater fen, as it was through most of the Neolithic period. It's an extraordinary glimpse of prehistory.
The most marvellous expanse of water. I mean, how typical would this have been of the landscape 4,000 or 5,000 years ago?
The reed swamp would have looked very much like what is growing behind you here, with patches of open water. And then eventually, later in the Neolithic, it developed into the wet woodland, and that too would have had pools of standing water in it.
So, for thousands of years, this part of Somerset would have looked like this. A huge wetland extending from the sea 25 miles away to Glastonbury, which was almost an island. At first sight, it doesn't look like a place where prehistoric people would want to live. To see if there was any evidence of settlements, I went to an exhibition of Somerset prehistory at the Pete Moores Centre, where I arranged to meet archaeologist Richard Brunning.
This is the most extraordinary structure. What is this, Richard?
Well, we're walking across a reconstruction of the Sweet Track, which is the oldest wooden trackway known in the UK, built in around 3,806 BC.
I mean, 3,806, you're not sort of pussyfooting around there, plus or minus 500 years.
No, we're very lucky. We managed to date it by tree ring dating or dendrochronology, so we were able to tell the exact year those trees were felled, which was the winter of 3,807 into the spring of 3,806 BC.
What would they have been using this track for? Just to get to the edge of the water?
Most of the trackways we know about were joining up islands in the middle of the valleys to the dry slopes. So they're a web of communication across the wetland.
So here they are building tracks through the marsh, which I suppose today we would think of as being pretty unattractive kind of area, but that wouldn't be how they'd seen it.
No, I think they'll probably see the wetlands as a rich area for many different things, for fish, for waterfowl, for reeds, for roof of their houses. So a lot of resources in the wetland.
So it sounds as if people were attracted to the wetlands and living here in some numbers. They've even found remains of houses which they've been able to reconstruct. If there was a thriving population living here, organised enough to build a substantial network of tracks across the wet peat bogs, I asked Richard if they might have been building terraces up on the Tor as well.
Evidence we've got from pollen shows that the area of the Tor was heavily wooded in the Neolithic and is very unlikely to have been a place where they would have made their clearances on such a steep-sided hill.
I now had a pretty good idea of what it was like round here 5,000 years ago. A huge wetland, flooded, with houses on dry islands. But the Tor itself was wooded. So it seems pretty unlikely that it could have been a Neolithic maze. The terraces must have been created later. But we may already have a tantalising clue about who else could have been active on the Tor. According to legend, after King Arthur was mortally wounded, he was taken to the Isle of Avalon, commonly identified as Glastonbury Tor. And we now know that for thousands of years, the Tor was almost surrounded by water. In effect, it was an island. So could there be some basis in fact for the legend? From those archaeological finds of pottery on the Tor, we know that there was some kind of settlement there in the 5th and 6th centuries, when it's believed that an Arthur figure might have been around. Could the terraces be the remains of defensive ditches for an Arthurian stronghold? How did Arthur come to be connected with Glastonbury at all? I discovered that though there'd been a Christian settlement on the Tor from the 7th century and a succession of churches up there, there's no record of Arthur in Glastonbury until the Middle Ages, centuries later. By that time, there was a huge abbey dominating Glastonbury, attracting pilgrims from all over the country. To see if the history of the abbey could shed any light on the Arthurian connection, I talked to Ron Hutton, the expert on local legends.
The key to the whole matter is here, right in Glastonbury Abbey itself. Disaster struck for Glastonbury in the year 1184, when somebody left a light on overnight in the old church, which stood right where we are here. It was very old indeed, but was completely made of wood, and it's totally destroyed along with the heart of the abbey. And that loses them their pilgrim traffic. Worse, it's an age of faith. They feel blighted by God, struck down for their sins. So Glastonbury Abbey has been physically, financially, and morally trashed.
In desperation, the monks cast around for a way out of their plight. They found inspiration in a rather unlikely quarter.
In the 12th century, a guy called Geoffrey of Monmouth writes the equivalent of a bestseller, which establishes Arthur as the greatest king in British history.
It seems that the resourceful monks saw King Arthur literally as a heaven-sent opportunity.
This is the old graveyard of the abbey, and 7 years after the fire, the monks dug down here, and as far as they're concerned, they found Arthur. On this spot here, they found the body of a huge man with wounds in his head, and beside him the body of a graceful woman who'd had blonde hair, and Guinevere just means blondie. The news went out all over Europe, the pilgrims came back, the money flowed in, the abbey was reborn.
They needed a miracle and they got one.
Indeed, one would say nowadays they manufactured one, but of course in an age of faith, there is no such thing as chance.
So the whole Arthurian legend seems to have been conjured up by the monks. But even if they weren't built by Arthur himself, the terraces could still have been defensive structures built by another warlord. Could the geophysical survey help us out here? By now, Meg Waters had processed the data.
Now, you were trying several analytical techniques up there in pretty awful weather.
Yes. Yeah.
What have you come up with?
As you can see here, we have a computer model of the Tor in 3 dimensions.
Oh, it's very nice, isn't it?
We can actually see the geophysical survey grid, which is located just here.
Can you bring that up there?
They'd first tried magnetometry to look for differences in magnetic fields, which can indicate where pits or trenches or defensive ditches have been dug. The background here is very homogeneous. It's not really giving us any clue to underlying structures, is it?
No. We don't really have anything in the data that I can interpret as being made by human occupation and impact.
And I remember you tried measuring electrical resistance. You were driving those electrodes in at measured intervals.
Yes. And here with the resistance data, the one feature that shows up pretty clearly is this path, this line going through the data, following the contour of the terrace that we were surveying on.
That's very much the line of the track where obviously a lot of people walk.
Mm-hmm.
If there had been any large constructions there, walls of a defensive nature or houses or something, you'd be sure to have found them, wouldn't you?
Certainly. There would have been big stone foundations or pits or some sort of manipulation of the ground. You would certainly see it with one of these 2 methods.
Yeah.
So, no evidence of any fortifications created by a warlord, or any other structures for that matter. With the lack of any scientific evidence, it seemed to me that I should go back to Glastonbury Abbey and reinvestigate its resourceful monks.
During the Middle Ages, Glastonbury was one of the most important Christian sites in the country. The evidence of its wealth and power are all around me. Is it possible that the medieval Christian history of Glastonbury is the key to the mystery of our terraces?
Even the ruins give us an idea of the size and wealth of the abbey. Its church would have been bigger than many cathedrals. Glastonbury Abbey was torn down, along with other monasteries in the country, in 1539 by Henry VIII. It seemed to me that the abbey was surely a power in the land and might have been able to transform the local landscape. The records from Glastonbury Abbey are now at Longleat House in Wiltshire. I went there to meet Steve Rippon, a landscape archaeologist.
The Longleat House actually acquired the records of Glastonbury Abbey after the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th centuries. And it's an amazingly rich archive. This is just a fraction of the records that actually survive.
Do they tell us anything, suggest anything about if they were making those terraces on the Tor?
Well, not as such, but what they do show is just how wealthy the abbey actually was. This is the Valor Ecclesiasticus, a survey commissioned by Henry VIII to assess the wealth of the monasteries, and in the 16th century, Glastonbury was the wealthiest abbey in the country.
And the records also showed how astute the monks were in managing that wealth and the manors on their estates.
These manors were spread quite widely across the landscape. They occupied different types of environment, different types of landscape. And the monks knew to adopt slightly different patterns of farming to suit the different landscapes. And in some places, even completely transforming the landscape to make it more suitable for agriculture. And this is best seen in the Somerset Levels.
The area now known as the Somerset Levels had once been that enormous wetland stretching to the sea, and it seems that it was the monks of Glastonbury who were responsible for draining it. They clearly didn't shrink from major land engineering. On the levels today, there's a huge network of canals, originally built by the Abbey, and still very much in use. Reclaiming the levels must have required drainage on a heroic scale. Even for a powerful and wealthy abbey, it would have been an ambitious enterprise.
So what did Glastonbury Abbey do to bring this land under control and production?
What they actually did was to canalise the major rivers that flow off of the uplands around Glastonbury. And one of those is the River Brew that we actually have here.
This here. Mm-hmm.
So they literally dug this huge artificial canal to take the water quickly and efficiently out to the coast.
It was a colossal amount of work.
For the monks, the land reclaimed here would have been valuable, but still liable to occasional flooding. This would make good pasture, but wouldn't have been so good for growing crops.
This area might not have been used for arable-based agriculture, which today we think of as being the most productive way of using the land. But the monks knew very well how to get the most out of these wetland landscapes.
By draining the levels, the monks created a great deal of good pasture. But they would still have been looking for arable land. Perhaps this was the key. Could the terraces have been created for ploughing? If Glastonbury Abbey could excavate miles of canals and drainage channels, carving terraces along the side of the Tor would surely not have been beyond them. But it would have been a huge labour. Would it have been worthwhile? I wanted to find out more about how hillsides were used for agriculture in the Middle Ages. I drove up to the Mendips, the line of hills to the north of the levels, to meet Somerset County archaeologist Bob Croft. He showed me agricultural terraces which have been carved into the hillside here. This is medieval work here, is it, these terraces we can
Yes,
see?
very clearly. It's linked in with the farmsteads which are scattered along this side of the Mendip edge, all the way along this edge of the Mendips. About every mile or two you come along to the next farm. And linking between them are these series of parallel banks, the lynchets, the medieval strip fields, right up on the side.
Now I could imagine the terraces as the strips of field they were in medieval times. This was obviously a common practice. But I was still surprised that it was worth all the work. I mean, it seems an awful lot of effort. You've got just a little terrace here. It's about 4 or 5 metres wide, and then you have to build this great bank. And up you go, maybe another couple of metres, and then you've just got another narrow strip of land. Well, it scarcely seems worth it when you've got all that land below.
Well, what you're looking for is some good land to grow your beans, your oats and the wheat. Not necessarily going to get that down on the edges, particularly if you get a wet summer, you get wet periods.
I know this wasn't the Abbot of Glastonbury's land, but the Abbey there would have been doing the same sort of work on their hillsides, would they?
Yeah, I think you've got to focus in on that because the growth in population would have meant more labour and the need, therefore, to produce a few more crops. And here, as on the Tor, no doubt they would have used the maximum amount of land available.
And if the terraces on the Tor had also been ploughed, this is how they would have looked. After talking to Bob, I'm convinced that I've found the answer. The terraces were created when the population was growing fast and land was in desperately short supply. Flat strips were carved into the hillsides to make use of every possible scrap of dry land for ploughing. From above, you can see that though the terraces are narrow, the monks would have gained a considerable amount of land overall. Some may be disappointed that the terraces were not created in Neolithic times or by King Arthur or a local warlord, but I think it was the monks of Glastonbury Abbey again. I can see that they were equally adept at manipulating the physical and the mythical landscapes. It's nearly 500 years since the Abbey was a power in the land, but even today the dead monks have not released their grip on Glastonbury. I came here to try to unravel 2 mysteries. First, the origin of these terraces on the Tor, and secondly, why this part of Britain has become the centre of such a swirling tangle of myth and legend. It seems probable that the medieval monks were responsible for both. They transformed the physical surroundings to produce the landscape which we see now, and they also created a mythical landscape which still endures. In fact, the myth-making tradition which they started continues and flourishes even today.